I never thought installing a simple above-ground pool in my own backyard would turn into a legal nightmare that nearly cost me my house. But when HOA President Margaret Sullivan decided to make me her personal enemy, she unleashed a campaign of harassment that escalated way beyond anything I could have imagined. Let me tell you how one woman's power trip ended up exposing corruption that reached all the way to City Hall. It started on a blazing hot Tuesday in July. I'd just finished setting up a 24-foot above-ground pool in my backyard for my 2 kids, Emma and Jake. Nothing fancy, just a basic circular pool from the local home improvement store, the kind thousands of families have in suburban neighborhoods across America. I checked the HOA rules beforehand, and there was nothing prohibiting above-ground pools as long as they weren't permanent structures. The pool had been up for exactly 3 days when Margaret Sullivan came marching across my lawn like she owned the place. Margaret was one of those women who turned being an HOA president into a full-time career. Mid-50s, perfectly styled gray hair, and the kind of authoritative voice that suggested she'd been telling people what to do her entire life. She carried a thick binder under her arm and wore an expression that could freeze lava. "Mr. Anderson," she announced without any greeting, "that pool is a violation of community standards and needs to be removed immediately." She opened her binder and pulled out what appeared to be a formal notice, complete with official letterhead and legal language that made my head spin. I looked at the notice, then at Margaret, then at my kids who were happily splashing in the pool behind me. "Mrs. Sullivan, I checked the HOA rules before I bought this. There's nothing that prohibits above-ground pools." I kept my voice calm, even though something about her aggressive approach was already putting me on edge. Margaret's smile was colder than January in Minnesota. "The rules have been updated," she said, pulling out another document from her seemingly endless binder. "Emergency Community Standards Revision, passed by the board last night. Above-ground pools are now classified as temporary structures that require special permits and monthly inspection fees." I scanned the document she handed me, noting that it had yesterday's date and appeared to have been written specifically with my pool in mind. The language was suspiciously precise, describing dimensional requirements that matched my pool exactly. "You passed this rule because I put up a pool?" I asked, though the answer was obvious from her satisfied expression. "The HOA board has the authority to modify community standards as needed to maintain property values and neighborhood aesthetics," Margaret replied with the tone of someone reciting a legal brief. "Your pool will need to be removed within 72 hours, or you'll face daily fines of $200 plus legal fees." That's when I knew this wasn't about community standards or property values. This was personal. Margaret had decided to flex her authority, and my family had become her target. But I had no idea how far she was willing to escalate things. I spent the next morning researching HOA law and discovered that Margaret's emergency rule change was questionable at best. HOA boards are required to give reasonable notice before changing regulations, and they can't target specific properties with retroactive rules. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next board meeting to formally challenge her decision. The meeting was held in the community center on Thursday evening. I arrived early, expecting a small gathering of board members and maybe a few interested residents. Instead, I found the room packed with neighbors, most of whom I'd never seen at an HOA meeting before. Margaret had clearly been rallying support, painting me as some kind of community rebel who needed to be stopped. Margaret called the meeting to order with the authority of a federal judge. She was flanked by 4 other board members who all seemed to defer to her judgment on every issue. When it came time for resident comments, I stood up to present my case, pulling out printed copies of HOA law and precedents that supported my position. "Mrs. Sullivan," I began, trying to keep my voice professional and calm, "I've researched the legal requirements for HOA rule changes, and I believe the emergency modification regarding pools doesn't meet the standards for legitimate governance." I distributed copies of my research to the board members, watching their faces for any sign of understanding or fairness. Margaret barely glanced at my documents before dismissing them with a wave. "Mr. Anderson, The board doesn't need legal advice from residents who refuse to follow community standards. Your pool remains a violation, and the fines will continue to accumulate until you comply with the removal order. That's when things got interesting. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 3 doors down from me, stood up from the back of the room. "Margaret, I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, and I've never seen the board pass rules targeting one specific family. This seems like harassment to me." Several other residents began murmuring agreement, and I could see Margaret's confident expression starting to crack slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially in public. "Mrs. Patterson, if you have concerns about board procedures, you're welcome to review our governance documents and submit formal complaints through the proper channels." But Mrs. Patterson wasn't backing down. "I am submitting a formal complaint right now. I think this board is overstepping its authority, and I think Mr. Anderson's pool is perfectly reasonable for a family with children." She sat down to a small ripple of applause from other residents who were clearly thinking the same thing. Margaret's face flushed red, and for the first time, I saw the real person behind the professional facade. She was furious at being questioned, and her response revealed just how far she was willing to go to maintain control. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced, slamming her gavel like she was sentencing someone to death. "The pool violation stands, and fines will continue to accumulate." As people filed out of the meeting, several neighbors approached me with words of support and stories of their own conflicts with Margaret. It became clear that my pool was just the latest in a pattern of authoritarian behavior that had been escalating for months. Over the weekend, I decided to dig deeper into the HOA's financial records and governance procedures. As a homeowner in the community, I had the legal right to examine the association's books, though Margaret had always made the process difficult for residents who requested access. Monday morning, I showed up at Margaret's home office with a formal, written request to review the HOA's financial statements, board meeting minutes, and expense records for the past 2 years. Her reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of the professional courtesy I expected, she became defensive and evasive. "Those records are confidential board business," she said, though we both knew that wasn't true. "I'll have to consult with our legal counsel before providing access to sensitive financial information." I pulled out a printed copy of state HOA law and showed her the section requiring transparency in financial matters. "Mrs. Sullivan, homeowners have the right to examine association records. This isn't optional for the board." Margaret's eyes narrowed as she read the legal requirement, clearly frustrated that I'd done my homework. "Fine," she said finally, "but you'll need to schedule an appointment, and all record reviews must be supervised by a board member." The appointment was scheduled for the following Thursday, and when I arrived, Margaret had clearly prepared for battle. She'd arranged the documents in a way that made them difficult to review systematically, and she hovered over my shoulder, making comments designed to distract and intimidate. But what I found in those records was explosive. The HOA had been paying monthly fees to something called Community Standards Consulting Services for over a year. The payments totaled nearly $30,000, which represented a significant portion of the association's budget. When I asked Margaret what services this company provided, her explanation was vague and unconvincing. "They provide professional guidance on maintaining community property values and resolving resident compliance issues," she said. But she couldn't produce any reports or documentation of work performed. More digging revealed that Community Standards Consulting Services was owned by Margaret's brother-in-law, a man with no apparent background in community management or real estate. The HOA had been funneling money to Margaret's family through a shell company, essentially embezzling funds from homeowner dues. But the corruption went deeper than simple nepotism. The consulting company's address was registered to a legal office that also represented 3 other HOA boards in neighboring communities. All of these boards had the same aggressive enforcement patterns, the same arbitrary rule changes, and the same mysterious consulting fees. Margaret had been running a scam across multiple neighborhoods, using her position as HOA president to generate income for her family, while terrorizing residents with bogus violations and excessive fines. Armed with evidence of financial fraud and corruption, I knew I had to be careful about my next steps. Margaret had already demonstrated that she was willing to escalate conflicts, and exposing her criminal activity would likely provoke an extreme response. I decided to consult with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes before making any accusations. Attorney Sarah Chen reviewed my evidence with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen similar cases before. "This is a clear pattern of embezzlement and abuse of authority," she told me during our consultation. "But we need to be strategic about how we proceed. Margaret will likely double down on harassment if she feels cornered. We decided to file formal complaints with the state's HOA Oversight Board and the District Attorney's Office, while simultaneously preparing a civil lawsuit on behalf of all affected homeowners. The legal process would take time, but it would provide protection against retaliation and ensure that Margaret couldn't destroy evidence." However, Margaret discovered that I'd been investigating the HOA's finances before I was ready to move forward with legal action. On Tuesday morning, I found a notice taped to my front door announcing an emergency special assessment of $20,500 per household to cover unexpected legal expenses and community improvements. The timing was clearly retaliatory. Margaret was trying to punish the entire neighborhood for my investigation, hoping that angry neighbors would pressure me to drop my complaints. But her strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of turning residents against me, the obviously punitive assessment made people realize that Margaret's power was out of control. Mrs. Patterson called me that afternoon, furious about the special assessment. "This is the last straw," she said. "Margaret's been bullying this neighborhood for too long, and now she's trying to steal our money. What can we do to stop her?" Within 48 hours, I had a coalition of over 30 homeowners demanding answers about the special assessment and supporting a comprehensive audit of the HOA's finances. Margaret had overplayed her hand, and the community was finally ready to fight back. The showdown came at an emergency board meeting called by Margaret to address what she termed disruptive resident behavior and threats to community stability. She'd clearly expected to use the meeting to rally support against me and the growing group of residents demanding accountability. Instead, she walked into a room packed with angry homeowners who had spent the week comparing notes about Margaret's authoritarian behavior and questionable financial decisions. The evidence I'd gathered about the fraudulent consulting fees had been shared with the coalition, and people were demanding answers. Margaret tried to maintain control by limiting public comments and dismissing concerns as conspiracy theories spread by disgruntled residents. But when Mrs. Patterson stood up and began reading from the HOA's financial records, detailing the payments to Margaret's brother-in-law's company, the room erupted. "You've been stealing our money," shouted Tom Rodriguez, a neighbor who'd been fighting his own battle with Margaret over lawn maintenance violations. "We trusted you to manage our community, and you've been running a scam." Margaret's response revealed just how desperate she'd become. Instead of addressing the financial allegations, she tried to deflect by escalating her attack on me. "Mr. Anderson's illegal pool is just the beginning," she announced. "I've documented numerous code violations on his property, and the HOA will be pursuing legal action to force compliance with community standards." She pulled out a thick folder filled with photographs of my house, taken from various angles and apparently over several weeks of surveillance. The images showed minor issues like a slightly overgrown hedge and a small oil stain on my driveway, but Margaret was presenting them as serious violations worthy of legal action. "You've been stalking my family?" I asked, genuinely shocked by the extent of her surveillance. The photographs included shots of my children playing in the backyard and my wife gardening, clearly taken from outside our property without our knowledge or consent. The room fell silent as residents realized that Margaret's harassment had crossed into potentially criminal territory. Taking photographs of children without parental consent was a serious legal issue, and the systematic surveillance suggested an obsession that went far beyond normal HOA enforcement. That's when Attorney Chen, who had been observing from the back of the room, stood up and announced that she was representing the coalition of homeowners in a lawsuit against Margaret and the HOA board. Mrs. Sullivan, the activities you've described constitute harassment, stalking, and potential criminal invasion of privacy. My clients will be seeking restraining orders and filing complaints with law enforcement. Margaret's face went white as she realized that her intimidation tactics had backfired completely. The room erupted in applause as residents who had been terrorized by her arbitrary enforcement finally saw a path to justice. The legal aftermath moved faster than anyone expected. Within a week, the district attorney's office had opened a criminal investigation into the HOA's financial irregularities, and Margaret was forced to step down as president pending the outcome of the fraud allegations. The state HOA oversight board conducted an emergency audit that confirmed everything I'd discovered in my investigation. Community Standards Consulting Services had provided no legitimate services to the HOA, and Margaret's brother-in-law was unable to produce any documentation of work performed. The $30,000 in fees represented pure embezzlement, funded by homeowner dues that should have been used for community maintenance and improvements. But the investigation revealed that the fraud was even more extensive than I'd initially discovered. Margaret had been billing personal expenses to the HOA, including landscaping for her own property, legal fees for unrelated matters, and even vacation expenses that she'd classified as community research trips. The criminal charges against Margaret included embezzlement, fraud, harassment, and stalking. Her brother-in-law was charged as a co-conspirator in the fraud scheme. Both faced significant prison sentences and were required to pay full restitution to the HOA and affected homeowners. The civil lawsuit resulted in a complete restructuring of the HOA's governance and financial oversight procedures. Margaret and her family were ordered to repay over $50,000 in fraudulent expenses, plus legal fees and damages for harassment. The punitive special assessment was immediately reversed, and homeowners received refunds with interest. 6 months after the pool controversy that started everything, our neighborhood had transformed completely. The new HOA board, elected by residents who were determined to prevent future abuse, focused on actual community improvements rather than arbitrary enforcement actions. My above-ground pool remained exactly where I'd installed it, and the arbitrary rule change that had targeted my family was officially reversed. The new board recognized that reasonable recreational activities should be supported, not prohibited. Through manufactured violations, Mrs. Patterson was elected as the new HOA president, bringing decades of community experience and a commitment to transparent governance that was the exact opposite of Margaret's authoritarian approach. The monthly board meetings became productive discussions about community needs, rather than intimidation sessions designed to silence residents. The financial recovery allowed for genuine improvements that had been neglected during Margaret's tenure. The community park was renovated, the entry landscaping was professionally updated, and a reserve fund was established to prevent future special assessments. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the restoration of neighborhood relationships that had been damaged by Margaret's divide-and-conquer tactics. Residents who had been afraid to speak up during the previous regime became active participants in community decisions, creating the kind of collaborative environment that HOAs are supposed to foster. The investigation into Margaret's activities eventually expanded to include the other HOA boards she'd been connected to through the fraudulent consulting network. 3 additional communities discovered that they'd been victims of similar embezzlement schemes, resulting in a total recovery of over $200,000 in stolen funds. The case became a model for HOA reform advocacy, with Attorney Chen using our experience to educate other communities about the warning signs of board corruption and the legal remedies available to homeowners facing similar abuse. Local media coverage of the story sparked broader conversations about HOA accountability and the need for stronger oversight of community associations. several state legislators introduced bills requiring enhanced financial transparency and limiting the arbitrary enforcement powers that Margaret had abused. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Margaret's attack on my pool was actually a blessing in disguise. Her overreach exposed a pattern of corruption that had been harming our community for years, and my decision to fight back ultimately protected dozens of other families from ongoing abuse. The key lesson from our experience is that HOA bullies rely on residents being too intimidated or too isolated to challenge their authority. Margaret's power came from homeowners' assumption that board decisions were automatically legitimate and that individual residents had no recourse against unfair treatment. But HOA boards are not above the law, and homeowners have significant legal protections against abuse of authority. Financial transparency, due process, and reasonable enforcement are not optional features of community governance. They're legal requirements that can be enforced through the courts when necessary. The most important thing I learned was that community organizing works. Margaret's scheme succeeded for years because she convinced residents that they were powerless to challenge board decisions. Once neighbors started sharing their experiences and working together, her authority crumbled almost immediately. Today, my kids still love their pool, and our neighborhood has become the kind of community that HOAs are supposed to create. Property values have actually increased since Margaret's departure, proving that reasonable governance and community cooperation are much more effective than authoritarian intimidation. Margaret served 18 months in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution to all affected homeowners. Her brother-in-law received probation and community service, but lost his business license and faced civil penalties that effectively ended his consulting scheme. The fake emergency pool rule that started this entire conflict was officially repealed, and the new HOA board adopted policies preventing the kind of arbitrary enforcement that had terrorized residents for years. Above-ground pools are now explicitly permitted, and the approval process for reasonable recreational improvements has been streamlined to encourage family activities. Every time I watch my kids playing in that pool, I'm reminded that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can expose the biggest injustices. Margaret thought she could use her position to bully one family into submission, but her abuse of power ultimately brought down an entire network of corruption. The moral of the story is simple. Never let anyone convince you that you have to accept unfair treatment just because they claim to have authority. Community associations exist to serve homeowners, not to enrich corrupt board members or satisfy power-hungry personalities who use their positions to terrorize neighbors. Stand up for your rights, document everything, and don't be afraid to seek legal help when necessary. Most importantly, talk to your neighbors and build coalitions of support. Bullies like Margaret depend on isolating their victims, but they crumble quickly when communities unite against abuse. If you're dealing with similar HOA harassment in your own neighborhood, remember that you're not powerless and you're not alone. The law provides strong protections for homeowners, and there are attorneys and advocacy groups specifically trained to help communities fight back against corrupt governance. That pool that Margaret tried so hard to destroy, it's still there, still bringing joy to my family, and serving as a daily reminder that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary victories when they refuse to back down from injustice. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have removed the pool to avoid conflict? Or would you have fought back against the abuse of power? Let me know in the comments, and remember to hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about standing up to neighborhood bullies and corrupt authorities. Sometimes the best victories come from the smallest acts of defiance, and sometimes the most important battles are fought in our own backyards.